into chapter 10 of the Gospel of Mark. He arose from there, so he'd come down from Caesarea Philippi in the first part of our study tonight, and he landed in Capernaum. And then it says in chapter 10 and verse 1, he arose from there and came to the region of Judea by the other side of the Jordan, and multitudes gathered to him again, and as he was accustomed, he taught them again. So here he's traveling from Capernaum to Judea, the other side of the Jordan, across from there, which would have been Perea. You're talking about, as you've just seen the arrow on the map, from Capernaum down maybe to across the Jordan in Perea. And this new location may explain a couple of things. You may have noticed in the last 2 or 3 chapters, Jesus hadn't just been going out to teach the multitudes as much. He'd been with his disciples, trying to help them grow and mature and showing them some things like the transfiguration, healing of the Syrophoenician woman, healing of the epileptic boy with the demon. And those things were, not where Jesus had purposely gone out and been teaching the multitudes. He had the disciples with him on those occasions. And so he'd been in different situations than he had been in the early part of his ministry, where the huge multitudes all around the Sea of Galilee were following him, and he was attracting crowds rather on purpose, doing miracles, teaching for long periods of time. His ministry the last little while in the Gospel of Mark and the other Gospels as well had become somewhat different, more focused on bringing along his disciples, the 12, and helping them to understand what they needed to understand. But now he's in a little bit different area than he's been before, at least in Mark's record, and he is teaching publicly. It says he began again. So now he's doing some public teaching again. And you have in verse 2, the Pharisees come and ask him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And asking this, they're testing him. They undoubtedly think that they already know the answer to that. They think that no matter what he answers, it will cause him trouble. And so they believe by asking him this question, they can do something to thwart his growing popularity, to cause him to lose favor with the people, and maybe to find something with which they can condemn him. This question about lawful divorce was a common question that was debated among the rabbis and religious leaders of the day. Jewish history tells us that in the 1st century BC and 1st century AD, this specific question was hotly debated between 2 different schools of the rabbis. One rabbi whose name was Hillel and the other whose name was Shammai had 2 greatly differing opinions on this particular question. Hillel taught a pretty liberal view of divorce, where you could divorce your spouse for just any reason. Shammai said it had to be for some specific moral impurity. Only for that reason could you divorce her. And so the rabbis, the Jewish leaders, were used to arguing about this. And no doubt, the people who asked Jesus the question were trying to get him either to take one side or the other, or to fall into a position where they could have a profitable debate with him. Again, they were used to debating this. He answers, of course, as one would expect the Son of God to answer, with wisdom and with authority. For he says to them in verse 3, what did Moses command you? Notice he doesn't ask, what do the rabbis say? How are your debates going about this? What do the brethren think? That's not the question. He goes back to the law of Moses, under which they were living at this time, and asks them, what did Moses command? They said, Moses permitted the man to write a certificate of divorce and dismiss her. That allowance was given in Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4. Jesus answered and said to them, because of the hardness of your heart, he wrote you this precept. What Jesus is saying there is that the law of Moses did allow divorce. He doesn't clarify their rabbinical debate about under what conditions divorce was allowed, but he does say Moses did allow that, and it is in Deuteronomy 24. But he says it was allowed because of the hardness of their hearts. The implication is that Jewish men did and would continue to divorce their wives without perhaps giving them a written statement of divorce, without going through any proper channels, mistreat a wife that they didn't care about, mistreat a wife who lost favor with them in such a way that she had no legal recourse or really no legal standing to remarry. And so Moses, in his law, made a provision to keep that from happening. But it wasn't God's ideal. And Jesus then points that out. He says, Moses, because of the hardness of your heart, wrote this precept. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this cause, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Jesus goes back and quotes from Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24. At the very creation of man and woman, God's intent was that they be united, that they be joined together as one. And Jesus says, what God has joined together, man ought not to separate. Let not man separate. He says, they are no longer two, but one flesh. What God has joined together, let not man separate. So Jesus goes back beyond the law of Moses to the original intent of God for marriage. I'm not sure that the Jews who asked him this question were expecting that. But Christ, in his wisdom and authority, as we've mentioned, gives exactly the answer that they need and that we need as well. In understanding the beauty and the sanctity of marriage, understanding that God intends for marriage to be as permanent as life, and that when a man and woman are married, and it is a man and a woman, when a man and woman are married, he joins them together in a relationship that is designed to be as permanent as life. Later on, Jesus' disciples ask him privately about this matter. In the house, the disciples ask him again about the same matter. In verse 11, he said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if a woman divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. Some who are familiar with Jesus' teaching on this subject might realize that in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus includes an exception to his statement. He gives a rule in Mark, and he gives a rule, the same rule in Matthew. But in Matthew, he includes an exception. He says that if a man divorce his wife except for the cause of fornication. So he allows that for the cause of fornication, if your wife has been sexually unfaithful to you, that you could divorce her for that reason. But he doesn't even give that exception in Mark's account of it. And Mark is just focusing on what the basic rule is. The basic rule is that God joins man and woman together for life. And that when a man divorces his wife and she marries another, she's going to commit adultery. She's committed adultery in doing that. And if a woman divorces her husband, and that's an interesting aspect of this, the fact that Jesus mentions the possibility that a woman could divorce her husband. A lot of Jews, a lot of the more strict Jews would not allow a woman to divorce her husband. Now, where Jesus is here, his physical location on the other side of the Jordan, probably among some more Grecian Jews, those who had had a little bit more exposure to Greco-Roman law and Greco-Roman culture, among some of them, women did divorce their husbands. And so he includes the statement about a woman divorcing her husband. He understands that's a possibility. In either case, whether it's a man divorcing his wife or a woman divorcing her husband, the remarriage results in adultery, a sin against God, a sin against the covenant that God has created between man and woman. It's a serious matter. Later on, the Bible will teach us that adulterers have no part in the kingdom of God and of Christ. And so adultery is a serious sin that must be repented of and forgiven if we hope to go to heaven.